The wedding guests had begun to whisper even before Sarah Chen stepped out of the rusted pickup truck. It wasn't the vehicle itself that drew their attention, though it certainly contrasted sharply with the luxury sedans lined up in the vineyard's parking area. It was what happened next that would become the talk of Riverside County for years to come. Sarah emerged from the passenger side wearing a dress that had clearly seen better days. The ivory fabric, once elegant, now bore the unmistakable signs of being stored in a basement for decades. The lace had yellowed slightly, and there were patches where moths had gotten a little too ambitious. But it was her feet that caused the first ripples of laughter to spread through the crowd gathered outside the chapel. She wore no shoes at all. Her bare feet, dusty from the gravel parking lot, touched the ground with a vulnerability that seemed almost defiant. The bride's sister, Catherine, had spared no expense for her own wedding. The venue alone cost more than most people earned in 6 months. White roses imported from Ecuador adorned every surface. A string quartet played Pachelbel's canon with practiced precision. The guest list read like a directory of the town's most influential families. Everything was perfect, calculated, and expensive. The invitation had specified formal attire, and everyone had complied. Except, apparently, for Sarah. Catherine's face drained of color when she spotted her younger sister. They hadn't spoken in almost 3 years, not since their mother's funeral had laid bare the fractures in their relationship. The invitation Sarah received had been a gesture, a formality really. No one actually expected her to show up. Certainly not like this. "Is that the bride's sister?" someone murmured. "What is she wearing? And no shoes. At a wedding like this? How embarrassing for Catherine." The whispers multiplied, spreading like wildfire through the well-dressed crowd. Some laughed outright, finding humor in what they perceived as either ignorance or audacity. Others simply stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and disdain. In their world of country clubs and carefully curated social media profiles, appearing at such an event in that condition was unthinkable. Sarah stood by the truck for a moment, her hand still on the door handle. She had known this would be difficult. The invitation had arrived at her address in the mountains, forwarded 3 times before finally reaching the remote valley where she now lived. She had stared at the embossed cardstock for weeks, debating whether to come at all. But Catherine was still her sister. Despite everything that had happened, despite the words that couldn't be taken back and the silences that had grown into chasms, they were still connected by something deeper than resentment. The decision to attend had cost Sarah more than anyone present could imagine. It had meant leaving her work for 3 days, a sacrifice that would set her back significantly. It had meant spending money she didn't have on gas for the borrowed truck. It had meant facing people who had known her in another life, when she wore designer labels and worried about thread counts. Most of all, it meant swallowing her pride and risking exactly this kind of reception. What the laughing guests couldn't know, was why Sarah looked the way she did. They didn't know about the flood that had swept through Pine Valley just 4 days earlier, destroying homes and livelihoods in a matter of hours. They didn't know that Sarah had spent the past 72 hours helping to evacuate families, sandbagging doorways, and pulling children from rising waters. They didn't know that her own cabin, modest as it was, had been compromised, and that she had lost nearly everything she owned to the muddy torrent. The dress she wore had been her mother's wedding dress, one of the few items she had managed to save. It had been stored in a waterproof container in her attic, a keepsake she had treasured. Her own clothes were either destroyed or still soaking wet. She had no money for something new, and the vintage dress, imperfect as it was, felt like bringing a piece of their mother to Catherine's special day. As for the shoes, her only remaining pair had literally fallen apart on the drive down the mountain. The sole had separated completely about 50 miles back, and she had made the choice to continue barefoot rather than turn around. Sarah had considered turning back at least a dozen times during the 4-hour drive. But something her mother used to say kept echoing in her mind: family doesn't stop being family just because it gets hard. Their mother had been a woman of extraordinary compassion, someone who believed that love meant showing up, especially when it was difficult. Sarah was trying to honor that, even as laughter now surrounded her like a hostile force. She took a deep breath and began walking toward the chapel entrance. The gravel bit into her feet, but she kept her head up. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, could hear the whispers growing louder. Someone's phone was out, probably already documenting this for social media. The walk from the parking area to the entrance couldn't have been more than 50 yards, but it felt like miles. Then, just as she neared the chapel steps, a figure moved through the crowd. He was impossible to miss, standing at least 6'4", with shoulders that suggested a lifetime of physical labor. His beard was full and graying at the edges, his skin weathered by sun and wind. He wore what was clearly his best attempt at formal attire: clean jeans, a pressed button-down shirt, and a bolo tie that looked like it might have been his father's. His boots were worn but polished. Everything about him spoke of the mountains, of places where dress codes mattered less than character. This was Thomas Brennan, though most people simply called him Tom. He lived even deeper in the mountains than Sarah, in a cabin he had built with his own hands 20 years earlier. He made his living as a wilderness guide and craftsman, creating furniture from reclaimed wood that sold in galleries for prices that always surprised him. He had known Sarah for 2 years, ever since she had moved to Pine Valley seeking a simpler life. They were friends, or perhaps something more that neither had quite named yet. When she had mentioned the wedding, he had offered to drive her down, sensing that she might need support. Tom had watched the crowd's reaction to Sarah's arrival with growing anger. He recognized cruelty when he saw it, and this was cruelty dressed up in pearls and designer suits. These people knew nothing of the woman they mocked. They hadn't seen her spend her last dollar buying groceries for a neighbor who had lost their job. They hadn't watched her sit up all night with a sick child when the parents needed rest. They had no idea that the woman they laughed at had more genuine grace in her dusty bare feet than most of them would possess in a lifetime. Without a word, Tom walked directly to Sarah. The crowd parted, unsure what to make of this mountain man who moved with such quiet purpose. He reached Sarah just as she was about to climb the chapel steps, her feet already bleeding slightly from the gravel. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice like gravel rolling in a stream. She looked up at him, and for just a moment, her composure cracked. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she was determined not to let them fall. "I can make it," she whispered. "Just a few more steps." Tom shook his head slowly. "You've already walked far enough." Before she could respond, he bent down and carefully lifted her into his arms. Sarah gasped in surprise, instinctively putting her arms around his neck. Tom cradled her with surprising gentleness for such a large man, as if she were something precious and fragile. The laughter died instantly. The entire crowd fell silent, stunned by this unexpected development. Tom began walking toward the chapel entrance, carrying Sarah with steady, unhurried steps. His expression was calm but unmistakably firm, and there was something in his bearing that commanded respect. This was a man who had faced mountain lions and winter storms, who had pulled people from crevasses and carried injured hikers to safety. The social judgments of this crowd held no power over him. As Tom carried Sarah past the guests, something remarkable happened. One by one, people began to truly see her. Not the absence of shoes or the imperfect dress, but the woman herself. They saw the cuts on her hands, still healing from digging through debris. They saw the exhaustion in her face, the kind that comes from days of selfless exertion. They saw something else too, something that made several of them feel suddenly and profoundly ashamed. They saw dignity. An elderly woman near the entrance, one of Catherine's great-aunts, suddenly remembered Sarah. "That's little Sarah Chen," she murmured to her companion. "She used to volunteer at the children's hospital. Every Sunday, for years. Such a sweet girl." The comment rippled outward. Others began to remember too. Sarah had been different before, in the years before their mother died and everything changed. She had been pursuing a law degree, working with an immigrant rights organization. She had been someone who cared deeply about making a difference. Then their father's business had collapsed in scandal, and the family that had once been part of this